We would like to welcome Dr. Holzberg. She is a clinical assistant professor and research associate at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Her research focuses on self-advocacy and academic skills relative to the transition of students with disabilities to post-secondary education. Dr. Holzberg is involved with the Council for Exceptional Children on a national and local level. Courses she teaches include service delivery systems and role management, universal design for learning, and teaching exceptional learners in the general curriculum. In addition to teaching courses, Dr. Holzberg is a research associate with Beyond Academics, a 4-year comprehensive transition program for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities and autism spectrum disorder. Today, her presentation is titled Teaching Self-Advocacy Skills, Increasing Access and Improving Outcomes for Students with Disabilities.
Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here and to share this information with you. We're going to just dive right into it. So with the agenda, you've gotten the brief introduction. I'll give you a little bit of background information on self-advocacy, including a problem statement. And then we'll talk about barriers in accessing accommodations. We'll go over the definition of self-advocacy. And then I want to leave you with resources to teach self-advocacy that are easy, sustainable, and then we'll leave some time for questions. We have 3 overarching objectives or goals. The first one is barriers and discussing barriers and the reasons students don't self-advocate. The second one is to define self-advocacy and to describe self-advocacy behaviors. And the third one is to apply an effective method to teach self-advocacy skills to students with a range of disabilities. So jumping into the statement of the problem, we know that over the years, we've seen a huge increase in students with disabilities attending post-secondary education settings. For instance, in 2005, 9.7% of students with disabilities attended post-secondary educational programs. In 2011, that jumped to 21.2%. Part of the reason for that, a large part, is increased access to accommodations through the Higher Education Opportunity Act. We also know, though, that 89.9% of students surveyed articulated a goal of completing college, but only 40.7% achieved their goal. Students with hidden disabilities like ADHD, emotional behavioral disorders, learning disabilities, and autism with minimum support needs have additional challenges adjusting to post-secondary education. So a little bit more information on students with high incidence or hidden disabilities who attended post-secondary institutions. And you can see the difference in the categories between 2005 and 2011. I think the one that we also want to make note of is in 2005, we had 0 students with intellectual disabilities attending post-secondary ed. And in 2011, data show that that number jumped up to 6.7%. I suspect that number is even a little bit higher now. We just don't have much more recent data than that. So that's awesome because now we're showing and we're seeing that students with disabilities have access to post-secondary education. The big question is, how do we help them succeed? So what do we know? We know that students with disabilities represent one of the fastest growing population of students at post-secondary institutions across the nation. We also know that they are at greater risk for non-persistence than their peers without disabilities. That means that we are more likely to see them discontinue or stop their education, leave, take longer to complete their education, and have so basically overall lower persistence rates. We also know that colleges and universities provide support and accommodations, but we know that those services are widely underutilized. We know that students are not using the resources available in a lot of the cases. So here's an example of that. So students, there's lots of literature to tell us that students may not be accessing their resources. One university reported that of all the students registered with disability support, only 7.9% were freshmen. And you can see that that number increased as they progressed through school. right? So by the time they were seniors, they realized, oh, if I want to stick around, or maybe even juniors, I better start using my accommodations because things are getting a little bit harder. That also shows us that students are not coming into or matriculating into post-secondary ed settings with the understanding of the importance of how to and the need for accessing their accommodations. And that's where in the secondary level, we can be really, really effective. Part of this barrier, or these barriers, also come from the way that students access accommodations in high school. So we know that in high school, they're served under IDEA and Section 504. So they may have an IEP or they may have a 504 plan. Those accommodations are going to be built into that. We also have child find, so that if a student is really floundering or not doing well, we're going to take some action to make sure that we're supporting them. But in college, that all goes away. Okay. They are served under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they have to go and seek their accommodations. So just because they're doing poorly in a class doesn't mean somebody's going to wave a flag and say, this student's doing poorly, what can we do? Some will, but many won't. They also have to provide documentation of the need for accommodations or the need for services. And that is widely, that widely depends on the university or the post-secondary or the college or the community college, whatever the setting is, it's going to be a range of documentation. Some schools will take a summary of performance, some will take an old IEP, some will take an old 504 plan, the most recent ones from when they were in high school, and some require full psychoeducational testing or a full, an evaluation. So it really, it's really important that we make sure that students have documentation so that when they do go to access accommodations in their post-secondary educational setting, they can have access to those. We also know that schools vary by their level of intensity and the amount of services they offer to their students. Some schools do an amazing job, and some schools have fewer resources and offer only the minimum. Okay. We also want to remember that in post-secondary ed, emphasis is on access as opposed to success. All the school has to do is provide access. They don't have to make sure the student is actually doing well. Other barriers include awareness of one's disability. So a lot of times we see that students, even if they had a disability in high school, think that it went away when they went to college. They may not understand the impact of their disability or how it impacts their learning or their ability to perform academic tasks. Often they're unprepared to disclose the disability, and we're going to talk a lot about that in a little bit. They may not know their rights and accommodations. They may not know that they're entitled to accommodations. And in one study, they found that students with disabilities who matriculate often don't understand the differences in the advocacy process when they transition from IDEA to ADA. So we're going to move on to our next goal, which is talking about self-advocacy, which falls under self-determination. So a quick definition of self-determination: it is behaviors in which one engages that enable a person to act as the primary causal agent in one's life and to maintain or improve one's quality of life. It is important to know that it is considered an essential component of transition to higher education and student success. So under self-determination, we have self-advocacy, and there are a lot of different definitions put out, but there is kind of an overarching theme, and it really boils down to a person's ability to recognize what they need and to articulate those needs and rights. So it's really understanding what they need, being able to identify it, understand it, and then express what they need. Self-advocacy strategies, we know, equip students with tools to facilitate transition. We know that they help them access their accommodations. And self-advocacy strategies include conflict resolution. Sometimes students won't go or don't want to access their accommodations because they're afraid of either disclosing to their professor, they want to shed the disability label, they don't know what to say, they're afraid of the professor judging them, or they're really afraid that the professor will push back Even though they're not really allowed to push back, students are often afraid of that conflict. So we know that these strategies are a key skill in helping students with disabilities transition. So I think it's important to identify some of the behaviors that fall under self-advocacy. So we'll start with knowledge of self. So how well does a student know themselves? And there are several subcomponents, including their strengths, their preferences, their interests. This all falls under the preferences, right? Strengths, preferences, interests, needs. When we're doing some of our transition assessments, we want to make sure that they know what their goals are. Their learning style, and that's kind of an interesting one because that's really up for debate. But I refer to learning style as their preferred method of receiving information and of expressing information. It's not really how they learn, it's really how they want to receive the information so that they can make sense out of it. We also want them to know what support needs they need. Do they need extended time? Do they need a separate setting? Do they need a scribe? What exactly do they need to help them be successful? And that includes also accommodation needs. So things, again, like separate setting and things like that. And the characteristics of one's disability. A student with ADHD or with on the spectrum may have some executive function challenges. So what does that look like? How are they going to need support in planning assignments and things like that? And then again, the responsibilities for what they have to do to get what they need. It's that self-awareness. The next one is the knowledge of the resources. So what's available to the student to be able to make sure they get what they need to be able to be successful. So what are their personal rights? That falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? What are the community rights, human service rights, rights as a consumer, as somebody who is a consumer of education, educational rights. What do they do if there's a violation? What if they have a professor who isn't willing to give them their accommodations, even with their letter from their Office of Disability Services? How do they advocate for change on a broader scale? And again, what are the knowledge of the resources within their institution and then beyond that to make sure that their needs are being met? Next is communication. How do students communicate? And this is a really big barrier for students, is not having the language or not understanding what they need to say or even how they need to say it. So assertiveness, are they being assertive or are they being aggressive? What about the use of assistive technology? How do they need to use that to communicate their knowledge or their understanding? Negotiation. I know you don't want me to record your class lectures, but I have a letter to do that. How can we work this out? The ability to listen, articulating their needs, persuasion, trying to make a good case. So if they do have an instructor who's resistant, they're able to have the language and the skills to be able to communicate what they need and to help the person see and understand their situation. Body language. Are they sitting all closed up with their arms crossed, or are they more open and relaxed? And what are they conveying through their body language? And then, the art of compromise is always important in lots of situations. The next one is leadership. So the subcomponents of that include the knowledge of the group's rights. So for students with disabilities on campus, what are our rights? Do we have power in our advocacy? Team dynamics and roles, advocating for others or for causes. There's a lot of students who need support. Maybe the institution isn't doing the best job or the job that they might be able to be doing to ensure that students have access. How can they work together to make sure that their needs are being met? Knowledge of resources, political action, and organizational participation. So those all fall under leadership. So does self-advocacy work? And I'm going to say in a very emphatic and enthusiastic, resounding yes. It works really, really well. Okay. We're going to talk about one specific method of teaching self-advocacy. There are multiple studies using this particular method done in a variety of settings in a variety of ways. I've listed a few of them. That have all yielded really positive results, or in research, what we call a functional relation, meaning you measure what your intervention, and you see if it's related to an improved outcome. So we're going to talk about this specific self-advocacy and conflict resolution instruction that makes it really, really sustainable, and it's a really good way to do it. And before I move on to exactly what it is, just to give you some context of students and the populations with whom we've used this, I've done several studies on this. I've had students with emotional and behavioral disorders. So I've had students with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. I've had students with ADHD. I've had students with autism, level 2 support needs. I've had students with autism spectrum disorder level 1, what we used to sort of call Asperger's. We've had students be very successful with this, students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So there are a range of studies with students with a range of needs, which have all demonstrated that they work and they are effective in helping students access and use their accommodations. So this particular training or instruction is, we just use the abbreviation SACRE, and there are 2 parts to the module. The first part teaches just self-advocacy. So what are the skills that the student needs to appropriately request academic accommodations? It falls with 7 targeted self-advocacy behaviors, and we'll talk about those in detail. And it is explicitly taught through scripted lesson plans using modeling and role play. More recently, we've done studies using note cards where the students have a visual prompt, and the results have been just as favorable. So in the beginning, when we first started, we had them memorize all the steps, but then I said, oftentimes people go into appointments with notes. Why can't they go into their meetings with their instructors with some notes or some speaking points? And so we conducted a study doing it that way, and it was just as effective. And a colleague also recently conducted a study using note cards, and it was effective with her in her study as well. Okay, the second module focuses on conflict resolution skills. So there are 7 targeted conflict resolution behaviors to help students work through any potential conflict. And that really helps them create the dialogue to resolve conflicts which might arise when requesting or implementing accommodations. This has been shown to be effective on students' ability to request accommodations in a number of different studies. So what do we know? We know that for students who are seeking accommodations, one of the largest barriers is their lack of language. In essence, it's really that they just don't know what to say or how to say it. And we see this when we collect like our baseline data, and we see students just hand the paper and say, here are my accommodations. Or they fumble around, just really uncomfortable, not knowing what to say or how to say it or how to even approach their instructor. So it really points to the fact that they don't have the language to advocate for their accommodations. They don't know how to say it. So this particular instruction gives them the language. It gives them the dialogue, the script really, to help them guide that conversation. So here are the 19 target behaviors. I've color coded them because we teach them in 4 separate sort of lessons or units. It's interesting that the first one is greets professor. And the reason is oftentimes they'll just come in and say, here, like I showed you, here are my accommodations, okay, without even saying where they're from or who they are. So we want to make sure that they set a context. And then we'll go through all of these, but I wanted you to be able to see them in a color-coded way, because that's how, like I said, that's how we break them out when we teach the skills. I will also say that some of these are repetitive, and we're working on another study. We're actually doing this, we're doing a study to access accommodations from instructors over Zoom or over a virtual platform, because obviously recently we've moved to so much virtual learning. We want to make sure that students are still comfortable and they have the language and the way to do that in online environments. So this is the first this is the first set of target behaviors. And I will show you resources where you can get all of this so that you can use this in the future. But it basically starts out with a dialogue. So the student gets this note card, and before we start working on this intervention, we meet with them and we talk about accommodations, we talk about the rights and responsibilities. We explain to them that they have rights to these, that they're not asking for something that they're not entitled to or that they shouldn't have, and that it's not a matter of being fair, it's a matter of equitable. And oftentimes the example I'll use is, if you wore glasses, your professor wouldn't ask you to take your glasses off because the rest of the class isn't wearing glasses. This is the same thing. We just want them to know that accommodations level the playing field. So this takes place in a dialogue back and forth. So if I'm the pretend instructor, then the student comes in with this note card and we engage in a dialogue. So the student says, "Hi, Dr. Plum, I'm Antique from your Monday, Wednesday history 1100 class." And then I might say, "Hi, Ann, how are you doing?" And then Ann might say back, "Good, and how are you?" And then Ann moves into, "I wanted to talk to you about my accommodations from the Office of Disability Services." And then maybe the professor nods or gives some kind of an affirmation. They go right into why they need the accommodation. They do not have to disclose their specific disability. And whether they choose to or not is up to them, but there is absolutely, they have no responsibility, the professor can't ask them. They do not have to disclose that. They are protected by FERPA and do not have to disclose that. But we do teach them to explain the functional limitation of the disability. This is why I struggle. And really because it gives the instructor context and it helps them understand why the student needs this and how it will help them. So Anne says to her instructor, "I have difficulty paying attention during quizzes and tests, and it impacts my grades." We practice this. We do it through explicit instruction, model, lead, test. So we do, I do, and then we do it together, and then they do it, okay? So there's a lot of practice. It doesn't take very long, especially if they use a visual prompt, but it gives them, we wanna make sure that the conversation flows. We will give them, when we do this in a study, when we're doing this as a study, we'll give them the opportunity to use their own language or their own words to make sure that they're most comfortable so that it sounds the most natural. Then they go on to say how their accommodations have helped them in the past. So Anne will go on to her instructor and say, "Last year in high school, or last year in when I was a sophomore, whatever it is, I took my tests in a separate setting." Then they explain how it helped. "It helped me concentrate on the quiz or test material." Then they go on and explain what they would like. They give their ask. "I think having a separate setting for quizzes and tests in your class would be extremely helpful as well." The next thing they're going to do is identify their responsibility and what they've done to take steps to make sure that they have everything in place to be able to use these accommodations. So then Anne goes on and says, "Before the semester, I registered with Office of Disability Services to get accommodations." And the professor might be nodding or just listening along. And then they say, "I will let ODS know I've asked you for a separate setting." Now, it can end there where then Anne says, "Does that sound like a good plan?" And then the instructor says, "Yes, that sounds great. Thank you so much." And they conclude it in a nice, personable way. She says, "Thank you." And then everybody goes on their way and the plans are made. But that's not always how it ends. So we want to make sure that if it doesn't end that way, they have the tools to be able to state their case and advocate effectively. So in this spot at number 9, Anne says, "Does that sound like a good plan?" And the professor says, "No, I'm not really comfortable with it." Okay. So when I do this with students and they say, "Does that sound like a good plan?" I say, "No, actually, it really doesn't." Okay. So then Anne says, "I understand you have some concerns. May I ask what bothers you?" So she's trying to sort of clarify what my issue is. And I respond and say, I don't think it's really fair. I don't think that you need to have in a separate setting. I don't think you need extra time. I don't think you need a note taker, whatever it is. I think it's an unfair advantage. And you look fine to me. I don't see anything wrong with you. So I don't know why you would need this. And then what Anne does is she reflects back. She says, so giving me a separate setting would be an unfair advantage and it's extra work for you. And I might say something along the lines, well, now I have to get the test or the quiz or whatever it is to disability services. And that takes time and it's just more paperwork. And I'm just really being miserable to her. Then she goes on and she wants to mutualize with them. And she says, from what we've discussed, I can tell that we both want me to do well, but we have different perspectives. And the professor's like, yeah, we have different perspectives because you want me to do more work or because this is, not fair to the other students. So then she says, let's try and negotiate here. Maybe we can come up with some solutions that work for us. She goes on to say, I've done this in the past. It's really helpful. I understand you're not comfortable with me taking tests in a separate setting. What if I take your quizzes? What if I take the quizzes in your office during office hours? And then you can supervise me and you don't have to deal with getting everything to ODS. And the professor thinks about it and says, okay, so, all right, I'm thinking about it. And then she restates it and says, well, I can take my quizzes or, at ODS or in your office. Which do you prefer? Okay, so now she's putting it back in the professor, the instructor's lap, right? Back on their side of the court. What's your preference? And then the professor says, well, I'd rather you have take them in my office during office hours. And she repeats it again, I'll take them there. And then she says, I'll let them know I've made the arrangements. So she's following up with her responsibility. And then she just does a thank you for working with me. I appreciate it. And I look forward to your class. Now, the reality is the professor really can't forbid her from using her accommodations or be a barrier to her using her accommodations. But it's also important to recognize there's a really big power struggle there, right? So she doesn't want to get into the instructor's bad graces, or again, as I mentioned earlier, she may be afraid that that the instructor is going to take it out on them in some way. So the best way to resolve this is to do it in an amenable, in an agreeable situation, so that she can feel comfortable and that she's able to use the resources to which she's entitled. Okay. We like to collect data. So we have a nice little data collection instrument that we use to collect our data to make sure that the student is reaching the target behavior. If you're doing this with your students, that's not necessarily necessary. You may not need to do that, but if you want to, we do have those available for you, and I'll take you there in a few minutes. Okay, and that's just the other half of the data collection sheet. And each target behavior is on the left-hand side, and then the opportunity to, when you're measuring the effectiveness, you can score it on there. So Sager instruction shows the research has demonstrated that it's effective with a variety of students, including students with ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and learning disabilities. And I don't have emotional and behavioral disorders on there, but it also has shown to be effective with students with EBD. We do it using explicit instruction. We do it using 4 30-minute sessions. I will absolutely tell you it can be done in shorter periods of time than 30 minutes, and it can be done in fewer sessions than 4. We do 4 because we need the data collection points when we go to publish our research, but it can be done in fewer, particularly if the student uses a visual prompt and they're not relying on their memory for it. So I always like to say that it is economical, temporally, so by your time, and fiscally financial, because it's not taking a lot of time. The other thing that that can be done, and we did a study on this recently, we had students in our university communication, our speaking center. We had a student who is a speaking center consultant do the intervention with students with disabilities. And so that's really using a peer supported model. It could be done, for example, if there's maybe a debate team or an honor society or any number of school-based groups who are interested in service, and if there is a Future Teachers of America, there are lots of groups within schools where once you know how to do this, you can teach students to do this using the peer support model. And that's been very, very effective as well. And it's a really natural way to do it. So I'd like to take you to the resources now. I've put the website on the link, and there's a QR code so you can access it in either way. And I'm gonna have to stop sharing for 1 second, and then I'll come back and share when I get to the website. Bear with me 1 second, and I'll get this pulled up, and then we can go on our little field trip. Because who doesn't love a field trip? I'm just trying to pull the site out. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and I'll take you on a little field trip where you can to make sure that you have access to all of these resources so you can do this. Okay, so several years ago, I created a website because self-advocacy is something I feel really, really strongly about. I think it's a game changer for students. And I really want to make sure that whoever wants to do this has access to these resources and understands the reason why we do it. So a quick little field trip on this is basically just a little bit what we talked about with self-advocacy. And then there's just some information about we should teach self-advocacy skills as early as possible. Students should be attending their IEP meetings and leading their IEP meetings. And we know that those are all evidence-based practices for predicting improved post-secondary outcomes. We want to make sure we're doing those things. But the reality is that doesn't always happen. And we are getting students in college who do not have these skills for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they've been taught, but they're not using them. We just want to make sure that we drive home the importance of using these strategies and skills so students can have the best chance at being successful in their post-secondary educational settings. So scrolling through the first page gives you just some background, okay? The next tab on this is really the differences between high school and post-secondary ed. And it lays out the legal differences, the documentation, self-advocacy responsibilities, the role of a parent or guardian, instructional differences, and then the student responsibilities. And I think that that's often really helpful for students to understand where their role is and what their role is in making sure that they know what the laws say and what their responsibility is as a student. The next tab has research supporting self-advocacy. And this is just a several snapshot of some studies that have been done to show how well it works and just basically the results. So if you like research and you want to read a little overview, you can do that. That's what's there. The next step is are the resources. And when we look at the resources, this is the section that will help you the most with hopefully doing this intervention with your students. Okay, so it's organized by the scripted lesson plan. So if I click on this, and hopefully you can still see that, it is the scripted lesson plan, and I will make it a little larger. Okay, so it's more accessible. And it's literally done so that you read through this and it tells you, it sort of walks you through the note cards the way that I spoke about it a little bit earlier. Okay, so it gives the goal of the skill, some examples, then you model it, then the student practices, and then you go into the role play. And then it's broken down by days and by target behavior. Okay, so it's all there. It's really, really clear, and it shows how to do it. These are the sample note cards. I usually print them out on cardstock. Depending on the student, I may or may not laminate them. Typically, lately we haven't been laminating them. They can also be done on index cards. I like to make it so that the font is clear and easy to read, and things like that. So those are the same ones that you saw in the PowerPoint a little bit earlier. Okay. I have also included them with blanks so they sort of look like Mad Libs so that you can fill them out yourself, and so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel there. Okay, and then it shows what needs to go in the little spot to make it really, hopefully, more accessible and easier to use for okay, so there are 2 modules, like I said. These are sample role play just for the first module because it ends a little bit differently. So it starts out the same, but then when we get to that conflict spot, if there's no conflict, then we just go right here to the 4th card, to the conclusion. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so this is just if you're doing the first part, which doesn't include the conflict resolution piece of it. Okay, I've included the operational definitions, which just gives you an idea of exactly what the target behavior would look like. So we really just want them to say a greeting, hi, state their name and the class that they take so that the instructor has context. And so you can go through all of these and see sort of what counts or what the definition is, as it needs to be used. Okay, the other part to this is there's a PowerPoint, and it talks about learning about post-secondary ed, knowing the rights and responsibilities. So it talks about what does it mean to have ADHD, or what does it mean to have a learning disability, so that they are better, aware of and can explain what their disability is. That's all part of something that falls under self-advocacy. Okay. So that is there if anybody needs to use that or wants to use that to help explain to students. And then there's a second one that we have for students who are already in college, so that will not apply to you, but it's out there in case you know people who might benefit from that. And then again, here are the data collection sheets. So if you decide that you want to take data, you are able to do that. In the resources, there are also some training videos that come out of Temple University Disability Resources, and hopefully they will load up, but they are linked, and then you can see those videos, and you can show them to students so that they understand a little bit better. I think we're having got the little spinning wheel going on here, but basically there are 4 videos, 4 videos to help sort of walk through some of the same steps. And that is pretty much the website. Like I said, the QR code is available, and the link is there. So we've taken our virtual field trip to see the resources. I hope that they will be useful and helpful, with also some resources I have on a Padlet, which is not just self-advocacy, but there are all kinds of educational resources that I've created over the past couple of years, with everything from evidence-based practices to all kinds of interesting and fun things. So go ahead and take a look at that if you're interested. It's not related necessarily to self-advocacy, but it is all things for educators, things to help and make your jobs easier, just lots of resources. And of course, my email, if you have any questions, any concerns. I know you all are working really hard out there. I know these are some really trying times. The kids really appreciate it. I know for sure when we do get them in college and they're excited to be able to have this opportunity to go to college. I'm happy to say that I have a lot of students in my classes who do access and use their accommodations. And I think if we just keep doing the work, we can really help change outcomes for our students. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk about self-advocacy or anything education. And thanks so much for being here and for your time, and have a great rest of the year, and just be good to yourselves.